Hi there! The US and their sketchy allies have planned or carried out several false flag attacks across the years in order to manufacture consent for otherwise unpopular military or diplomatic actions. Let's take a look at some together. In the early 1960s, the entire United States military and security apparatus had become completely intent on overthrowing Castro's socialist government in Cuba, one way or another. This project was known as Operation Mongoose. The methods which were proposed and ultimately failed varied, of course, from orchestrating Castro's assassination with help from organized crime, which we've covered on the deprogram here, to plans to spread doctored images of Castro as obese and living a lavish lifestyle. The US believed that Cuba could set an example for leftist uprisings in other Latin American states, and they would collectively pose a threat to the interests of US companies and military bases in the region. What I want to focus on is a specific subset of these plans, called Operation Northwoods. These were proposed actions that would be taken in order to deceive the public into supporting outright war against Cuba, again with the goal of removing Castro. In 1961, the US attempted a secret invasion at the Bay of Pigs, in which the CIA funded and trained Cuban exiles with intended support from US forces. Their defeat was as swift as it was humiliating, taking only 3 days. The US had relied on the Cuban public to also attempt to overthrow Castro, but were instead beaten back by them. A year later, despite the ongoing campaign of economic pressure, state-sponsored terrorism, and attempts to assassinate him, Castro's government held firm. This failure became the catalyst for Operation Northwoods, as the US gave up on inciting the Cuban Revolution against Castro and instead pivoted towards drawing up support for their own invasion. The plans drawn up were false flags, largely consisting of the US government murdering US citizens or Cuban civilians and then blaming the Cuban government for it. The planned actions included, but were not limited to, terrorist attacks against civilians in US cities, hijacking US planes, assassinating Cuban refugees in the US, and destroying the US military ship in Guantanamo Bay while blaming the Cuban military. I made a deeper dive into the more sinister side of these plots here.
Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Incogni. A little while back, a massive data breach involving the National Public Data Company exposed tons of personal information of millions of people to the public, including their social security numbers. NPD is a data aggregator, meaning it gathers info from all kinds of sources without your permission or knowledge. That kind of unchecked collection makes it easier for determined hackers to cause serious damage. Having your private data floating around online puts you at risk for scams, identity theft, harassment, and even stalking. Breaches can reveal your name, login info, address, location history, and much more. What's worse, many data brokers sell this info in bulk to companies and might use it to raise your insurance rates or target vulnerable groups. So how does Incogni solve this issue? Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests your personal data removal, and deals with any objections from their side. With an annual subscription, you get ongoing protection and peace of mind. And for my viewers, you can get a massive 60% discount on an annual Incogni plan using my link and the code HAKIM. Getting started is easy. Just sign up, authorize Incogni to act for you, and relax while they work to remove your data, manage responses from brokers, and keep you informed on every step of the way. So what are you waiting for? Click my link in the description, use the code HAKIM and get your 60% off an annual Incogni plan and start protecting your data today. Thanks to Incogni for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video.
The documents relating to these plans were only declassified as part of a committee on the Kennedy assassination. Had that not happened, or had these plans actually gone through, it's likely we still wouldn't know about them. These things very nearly happened. They were not just random suggestions from some obscure meeting. The plans were signed off by all of Kennedy's Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior people in the Department of Defense. They had the acceptance of the military establishment and made it to the president's desk. They were only stopped by civilian leadership to an extent and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba's socialist revolution was successful and its broad public support spooked the US government. Failing its attempts to secretly remove Castro, they tried to frame the Cuban government through manufacturing atrocities supposedly done by them. Note that they didn't even attempt to discredit the actual way Cuba was being governed. Instead, they just accused the government of entirely separate and fictitious crimes, hoping that this would allow an invasion while distracting from the Cuban government's success. The legal basis and major reason for America's direct involvement in the Vietnam War was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed in 1964. This allowed the president greater powers to authorize military action, especially in Southeast Asia. It was passed because of 2 incidents involving US military destroyers near Vietnam on the 2nd and 4th of August of that year, while North and South Vietnam were at war. It was presented as such to both Congress and the US public. North Vietnamese ships had attacked US ships on both the 2nd and the 4th. These were claimed to be completely unprovoked surprise attacks in international waters, despite many years of direct US support to French colonial presence in Vietnam. The US was very definitely involved, for years at that point. This story was, unsurprisingly, completely fabricated though. A number of key details were completely changed in order to justify the war, of course. Both ships were in the Gulf in order to support the South Vietnamese in their military actions. The South Vietnamese Navy was at the time engaged in attacks on military targets under supervision of the US Department of Defense, and the US ships were there providing reconnaissance support. This is why North Vietnamese boats were patrolling the area in the first place, so unprovoked is already a bit of a stretch given that the US was actively helping one side of the war. But what was worse than this is that the US actually opened fire first. It fired so-called warning shots on the Vietnamese boats, which they only retaliated to. Given the US claims that this attack was in international waters and before the US got involved in the war, there's no reason to have even fired warning shots at all. Furthermore, while the military had presented this as a somehow dangerous attack, the US ship actually took no damage and no casualties. It received air support from a nearby US carrier and badly damaged one of the Vietnamese ships. North Vietnam is said to have assumed that the ship was involved in the attacks, and as we know, they were completely correct. So here's an accurate recap of the events on the 2nd of August. A US ship was spying on North Vietnam, helping to coordinate attacks through a US proxy that it was at war with. Upon seeing some North Vietnamese ships, a US ship fired upon them. When they retaliated, a US aircraft carrier joined the attack. North Vietnam took casualties, and the US didn't. Clearly the US was the attacking party here. This still leaves the incident on the 4th of August. Or rather, it doesn't. Nothing happened on the 4th of August. The US intercepted North Vietnamese communications, most likely plans to salvage the boat from the fight on the 2nd, which the US interpreted as an attack. After sending 2 destroyers out to sea, they allegedly saw things on the radar and began firing into the water. US air support confirmed that there were no nearby ships. The captain of the boat involved on the 2nd suggested that there had been no contact, and that the storm, combined with overeager sonar operators, had caused the reports. The embarrassing incident on the 4th of August didn't involve North Vietnam at all, just a trigger-happy and massively overfunded US military starting a fight with its own shadow. If there was any doubt as to who instigated the incident on the 2nd, the fact that it happened again on the 4th without North Vietnamese presence at all should make it completely clear how eager the US was for war. The then president authorized strikes against North Vietnam immediately after the 4th. Alongside the US military establishment, they successfully got their narrative of events accepted, convincing Congress and a large portion of the US public for the need of war, based on entirely fake claims of aggression.
America, black people were brutalized, the police occupy our community, and the foreign troop occupies territory.
The Black Panther Party was a black nationalist and socialist organization founded in 1966 in the United States by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. It quickly became the most famous militant black power organization of the time. They were popular amongst young urban people of color, but extremely vilified and hated by the wider white American public, and especially the national security establishment. Their revolutionary ideas adapted and synthesized widely from the writings of Frantz Fanon to Maoism and revolutionary black thought, especially Malcolm X. They correctly didn't believe that nonviolence could achieve their goals, and as such were militant. While this means that they prepared for violence and often carried weapons, it doesn't mean they were violent. Instead, they, like many Marxist-Leninist or nationalist movements, saw some degree of violence as necessary self-defense to stop their oppression. Nor was violence their only activity either. They were engaged in peaceful campaigning for a variety of social reforms, and notably delivered massive amounts of community aid to black people across America. In what they called survival programs, they provided basic necessities to black communities. They had a large free breakfast program, operated clinics, funded legal procedures, and clothes drives, and even had schools. Their last stated platform contained the explicit request for peace alongside basic necessities and black national determination. To the FBI, this was threatening, of course, both peaceful and quote-unquote non-peaceful action. The Panthers expressed willingness to use violence to prevent police brutality, and as such, they were considered violent. Had they never held a gun in their life, they would have still been considered violent. They expressed the desire for black people to have their own state, or at least some autonomy in their affairs, along with justice, and as such they were anti-American. And supremely based, of course. This is all aside from the point that they did everything under the letter of the law, which is why legislation was made to change the law in order to outlaw the Black Panther Party. The FBI from the late 1950s through to the early 1970s was engaged in a program called COINTELPRO. This was a widespread program aiming to neutralize organizations it deemed threatening to the interests of capital in the US. Their aim was not to prevent or punish crimes, but explicitly to destroy, almost exclusively, far-left organizations. Illegal even by American standards, whatever those were worth, they used a variety of dirty tactics to attack not just Marxists, but anti-war, anti-armament, or minority racial group activists. The Black Panther Party became a major target of FBI harassment in this period, due to its ideological grounds and willingness to resist police harassment. The organization embarked on a long-term campaign to eradicate the Panthers, using all the underhanded tactics that they had at hand. This included misinformation and sabotage, and violence, of course, to the point of murder. They also attempted to disrupt the most obviously legitimate community activities like the Breakfast for Children program and the party newspaper. Some of their most deceptive tactics included sending fake letters from the Black Panther Party to street gangs in order to provoke attacks on them from organized crime. Similarly, the FBI sent the Black Panther Party fake letters from parallel black nationalist organizations to stoke tensions. They allowed their informants to act as agent provocateurs, continuing their involvement in the party and pushing it further to illegal activities. Some suggest that this atmosphere of oppression actually led the Panthers to militarize even more and develop something of a siege mentality. While it's impossible to know the full extent of it, we know of at least one case of them trying to frame the Black Panther Party for a shootout with the police. Such was the case of the assassination of Fred Hampton.
I don't believe I'm gonna die because I got a bad heart. I don't believe I'm gonna die because of lung cancer. I believe that I will be able to die as a revolutionary in the international revolutionary protest struggle.
Hampton was a founding member of the Chicago branch of the Black Panther Party, beginning only 2 years after the wider organization. On December 4, 1969, an apartment in use by the Black Panther Party was raided by police. There was a violent clash that left Hampton and another leader dead, and several members wounded. The police claimed that they had died in the process of a major shootout. It was later proven by physical evidence that only one single shot, was fired by those in the apartment. The police, on the other hand, had fired around 90. Hampton was in bed when he was shot. The bloody mattress and pool of blood on the floor showed that Fred Hampton was shot at point-blank range in his bed while asleep, and his body was dragged out into the hall.
By their own testimony, they admit that for 12 minutes there was gunfiring in that apartment. Yet the federal grand jury concludes that only one possible shot could have come from a Panther weapon, and that shot could have come through the door by a man who had just been shot in the heart.
It was also later revealed that the FBI had planned the assassination, a part of their wider targeting of the Panthers and Hampton specifically. They later tried to cover up their involvement and real intentions, disobeying a court order and harassing survivors in the process. A side note, because I always learn something new every time I read about COINTELPRO, there was a pretty famous actress at the time named Jean Seberg. She was a target of the FBI because of her political sympathies and financial support for civil rights organizations during the 1960s and early 1970s. Her open support for the Black Panther Party, especially at a time when the FBI was aggressively attempting to neutralize it, caused her to be under constant surveillance. Under orders of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, agents started a sustained campaign of psychological warfare against Seberg intended to destroy her credibility, isolate her professionally, and eventually result in her suicide. She put up with break-ins into her home, wiretapping, threatening calls and stalking, whether in the US or Europe, with the CIA going as far as contacting agents in their embassies in Rome and Paris to continue their stalking, surveillance, and intimidation of her. In 1970, agents fabricated a story that Seberg was pregnant by a member of the Black Panther Party, and anonymously leaked the nonsense rumor to the Los Angeles Times. This was only 50 years ago, but at the time that a white woman would sleep with a black man was considered incredibly scandalous and reputation-destroying. What a disgusting country. The story, picked up by national and international media, was specifically calculated to maximally damage her public image. Internal FBI documents show that the Bureau was fully aware and intended on this harm, explicitly noting that this was to cause her embarrassment and serve to cheapen her image with the general public. The stress of this caused her to go into early labor, where her child died. Of course, the fact that the child was white and that the rumor was false didn't make the rounds. She would eventually develop a barbiturate addiction and commit suicide in Paris. All this was of course carried out without criminal charges or due process, as if that would make it okay. In 1954, Israel attempted a stereotypical example of a false flag operation, later referred to as the Lavon Affair. Agents in Egypt attacked US civic buildings with bombs and arson. The plan was that the local Arab population would receive the blame and that this would worsen Egypt's relations with the West. They failed. Egyptian security was informed and caught all of the Israeli agents. Instead of making the Egyptian government seem unstable, it made them seem effective, while Israel seemed incompetent, as they so frequently are. Around a similar time, Israeli intelligence agencies were responsible for a series of bombings in Iraq, this time targeting the local Jewish community. Their aim was to terrorize them in order to force an exodus of the ancient Iraqi Jewish community to Israel, bolstering the state's Jewish population. It significantly worsened tensions between Jewish and Muslim populations in Iraq, and forced Jewish Iraqis into accepting flight to Israel as they had little other option. Of course, Israel denies it had any role in the attacks in Iraq, despite evidence, but they also denied the ones in Egypt. That's the issue with these covert operations. They'll always deny them. Israel now engages in a modern equivalent of the above, a sort of post-truth false flag. It doesn't bother to stage an incident first, it simply jumps right to lying about it. It's trivial to list examples of the propaganda, but here's a few high-profile examples you might have heard of. The IDF killed 15 paramedics and buried them in an unmarked grave. They claimed the ambulances were unmarked and moving suspiciously towards IDF troops. Video later came out revealing that this was false, of course, and that the ambulances were clearly lit up, correctly labeled, and moving erratically because they were being harassed by IDF troops. Again, as if the inverse would make it okay for IDF to shoot at a literal ambulance, or anybody else for that matter. Another example. The IDF attacked the El Ahli Arab Baptist Hospital, killing nearly 500 people, after which they released a fake audio of a made-up phone call attempting to frame a Palestinian resistance group for it. The audio was supposed to be a candid conversation admitting that it was Palestinians that carried out the attack, but the propaganda machine quickly dropped the story because the accents, turns of phrase, and tone were all wrong. In one of the clips, you can clearly hear a fairly thick Hebrew accent, and in another they get an entirely incorrect dialect of Arabic. It was laughably bad. It's also widely known that Israel monitors phone calls. No one is admitting anything through phone conversations. After attacking a separate hospital, they uploaded a video of what they claimed was a list of terrorist guard names to prove that the hospital was a legitimate target. It was in fact an Arabic calendar. The terrorist names were Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It was genuinely that stupid. After yet another hospital attack, they posted a video of a nurse discussing her difficulties in working because Hamas has taken over the hospital. Her accent was also entirely wrong. Nobody from the hospital recognized her. There was stock royalty-free explosion sounds, unironically, and the nurse's makeup was entirely perfect despite being in an active war zone. It's just one weak lie after another. There's a clear pattern. No serious effort is put into making the lies convincing, and many of them don't even make logical sense. But that's the problem. Catching the Israeli government in a lie means nothing at this point. This is what I mean by the post-truth version. The strategy works because they don't care if they're caught lying. The people who notice they're lying can't do anything about it, and the people who can do anything about it don't care that Israel is lying, or actively support it. They can be confident that their allies will uncritically publish everything they say and take the quantity approach. It's lazy lying meant only to engage the already convinced and create the illusion that there's two sides and things are still being debated. This isn't what we usually think of when we hear a false flag. We imagine something like the Lavon affair in Egypt. But as shown in the Gulf of Tonkin and assassination of Hampton, it's not always about faking an attack. It can be about making an attack seem like a battle. This is what Israel does constantly in Gaza. It's about deceiving the public and framing the opposition. It's about justifying aggression. They don't bother to make good or believable false flags, but it's the same deception. The sheer laziness of the fabrications reveals the sad truth. With the institutions jumping at any opportunity to parrot Israeli propaganda, Israel doesn't even need to stage attacks to be believed.
Hamas offers nothing but terror and bloodshed.
They unleash terror, then hide among them. Women and children used as human shields.
Anything, of course, for the profits of American arms companies at the expense of hundreds of thousands of lives, environmental destruction, and dwindling living standards in the countries that do all the funding of the ongoing genocide. A better world is possible.
Internationale misdaadstand gelijk.